So, welcome, Vanessa, to Raw and Cooked Vegan.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be with you.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And the way I usually start these, Vanessa, is simply to have you relate for the audience how you were raised in terms of diet. Was it basically a standard American diet? Did you have any kind of nutritional awareness as you were growing up, that sort of thing?
That's quite a question. I I was brought up mostly right outside of Manhattan, in the suburbs of Long Island. My parents are a mixed bag around this stuff. So I was raised maybe a quarter on the standard American diet, but my father is a restaurateur, and he's a chef and he's from Italy.
Okay.
Immigrated here when he was a teenager. So he, works every day, many, many hours a day at the restaurant. And I grew up largely there, in the kitchen with him. And, every night, remember getting a phone call around 11:30 before he would close up for the day saying, what do you guys want to eat tomorrow? So, a lot of my food actually came straight from my dad's kitchen at the restaurant. So lots of Italian food, certainly not vegan. Um, but for the most part, I think like a lot of, I don't know, I guess you can't say home cooked meals, but kitchen prepared meals at the
And
restaurant.
probably good, high quality.
Yeah, fairly high quality. It's been an interesting evolution, as I've gotten more involved in food movement stuff and sustainability and farming and agriculture stuff. Talking to my dad about sourcing and his practices in the kitchens. That's sort of been an interesting development in the past 10 or 15 years. But no, I grew up eating a lot of chicken franchise, a lot of meatballs, a lot of pasta, tons of pasta, and probably three quarters pasta.
Yeah.
But my mother comes from, the Mid-Atlantic region. So also, she would cook for me too every once in a blue moon.
Okay.
So
And does your dad still run a restaurant?
He does.
Okay. Okay. Cool.
He does. Yeah. He's been in the same spot for about 36 years now on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and stuck to it. And one of the hardest working guys I know.
Yeah, that's got to be a highly competitive area there for restaurants. But so what happened? Like, at what age did you start thinking about dietary changes? Was it for health reasons? Was it for environmental reasons, ethical reasons? What prompted you to start thinking about this?
Yeah, the trigger for me was towards the end of college. I went to school in New York City, and for the first time, kind of just started to realize a vague displeasure with not feeling any connection to the outside world. So, I figured, why not check out a farmer's market? Why not start cooking? I really had never cooked myself. And it occurred to me that I had basically zero survival skills. God forbid anything happened, I was going to be the first gone. And that kind of irked me. So I got more and more into cooking. That was sort of how I got into it. And, the stuff that I could find at the Union Square Farmers Market was a whole different product than what I had been used to. So it was sort of a revelation to me to figure out how much goes into creating a meal for yourself and sustaining yourself. That evolved fairly quickly into politicizing around it. And, I had been studying government and propaganda, media stuff. And, as I got more fascinated with cooking, I started learning about some of the propaganda within our own corporate ag environment now, and, looking into stuff around the tomato pickers in Florida and all of that. And it was fascinating to me, and I sunk my teeth into it. And eventually decided I wanted to learn more about farming. Did a couple years apprenticing on some farms, which was the best. Further politicized me, and eventually I started to really see the strong links between food and agriculture and food policy, and then eventually environmental policy, and now climate policy, where I work full time.
Okay.
So it was a slow evolution, but it definitely started for me around the time when I realized, gosh, I don't do very much for myself at all in the way of my own survival.
Interesting. And were you getting a degree in another field, and then this kind of became your primary interest? Did you finish your degree, or did you change degrees?
Yeah, of course, as it were, sort of fell in love with all of this stuff right towards the end of my school. So I guess probably safe to call it around senior year, yeah. I
Okay.
had been studying communications, specifically around media policy and government policy as it relates to media at NYU, and again was lucky enough to be able to dovetail my interest in food and food policy stuff with that towards the end, and I started, being able to write more papers around it and do more research where those two things intersected. But I graduated shortly thereafter, which gave me the opportunity to farm and, work a little, save some money.
Yeah.
But I ended up going back to grad school a couple of years later to get a degree in environmental public policy, focused specifically around food and agriculture. So I did go back and sort of scratch that itch for more sort of robust academic learning around it.
Okay. All right. And for the viewers, you're a vegetarian. So tell us, when was your initial interest in perhaps eschewing meat? When did that arise in all this?
Several times. I've gone back and forth a couple of times in my life, and now I've been sort of steadily vegetarian for 3.5 years or so. First time I ever tried it was in college, right around that time when I started purchasing food for myself and not just eating out all of the time. And frankly, I realized how much more expensive it was to buy meat that looked like something I actually wanted to eat. So a combination of, maybe frugality or economics and just being kind of interested in challenging myself to learn how to cook things that I had never eaten before. I had never made lentils for myself. I had never tried Thai food or Indian food. I certainly had no idea how to soak and dry tofu. So it felt like a good challenge, and I kind of wanted to see what it would do to my body. It wasn't so much political, and it wasn't so much about animal rights then. But it was really fascinating, and I took to it and liked it a lot. Sort of wavered back and forth before making a real ethical commitment around it later on.
Okay.
But I have wavered. I worked on farms for years that grew livestock and sold contract meat. And I think there's a lot of value in that as well. And I think environmentally, it's an interesting conversation about the benefits of animal livestock on a very small scale and sustainable scale. But I moved back to the city in 2011, and I decided here for a number of reasons to recommit to being a full vegetarian, namely because I'm so fortunate not to need to supplement my diet with animal protein. I have a lot of cooking facility now. I love to cook. It's what I love more than almost anything. And economically, I can afford to feed myself a healthy diet. Animal consciousness to me feels like a very precious thing to end if there's not a real need there.
I think you're raising a very interesting point there, which is that in a lot of poorer cultures, it's not really an option.
That's right.
Maybe you could say something about that. I remember when in my younger days I worked at a health food store, and one of the employees had a line. She said, vegetarian is for rich people. So in some ways that's not true, but in some ways that is true, and I think that's kind of what you're saying. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I think there's so many shades of gray here. First I'll say my father grew up, a farmer in Italy, in Sicily, extremely poor wheat family, subsistence farming, right? Selling, wheat to the grain mill. When he talks to me about the way that they ate back in Sicily in the 1950s, he said, we loved meat. We cherished meat. We idolized the idea of eating meat, and we ate it once a year because who could afford it? We had it on Christmas. It was the thing that we looked forward to the entire year.
Yeah.
I grew up hearing about cucina povera, the food of the people, of the poor.
Ah, okay.
So I think it so much depends on your climate and where you're farming. And so for the people of the world, I mean, it can be so different. The Via Campesina, the folks whom primarily I know at least are working in South America have access to incredible land for cattle or for animals. Folks have to survive. In a lot of cultures, cherishing the way that you raise your animals is extremely important. And some of them get processed for meat, and some of them get sold, and some of them are used for their fiber. It's an incredibly important economic staple for people around the world who don't have the privilege to live like I do in a, apartment building in the middle of Brooklyn.
Right.
And one of the things that I think I'd love to see the food movement evolve around is not shaming different cultures who still rely a lot economically and culturally on eating meat. However, the way, of course, that we do it in the standard American diet and throughout a lot of North America is couldn't be more different than that.
Right.
So, teasing apart the differences there and figuring out, what is responsible and what is blatantly irresponsible is important.
Great. And that's one of the reasons I'm so happy to talk to you, because we're going to talk more about some of these groups that you're involved with. But can you define for us vegetarian food? Does that mean that, of course, fruits and vegetables and then eggs and dairy are acceptable to you?
To me, at this point, yes. And I tweak this a lot depending on my life circumstance. Every couple of years. For the past 3 years, I've been vegetarian, no meat, no fish. I am eating eggs and dairy and honey, sourced in a way that I feel good about.
Yeah.
And I'm lucky enough to have worked in the field long enough to have built relationships with different vendors and farmers nearby that, I am so lucky to be able to support.
Right. And would you say, like, this might be hard to find this number, but how much of a percentage of your diet would you say eggs and milk make up? It's probably fairly limited, right? I would guess.
Yeah, I mean, I try and have at least 1 to 2 vegan meals per day, just to keep me thinking about it and really present to the choices I'm making.
Yeah.
I'd say if I had to throw a number on it, maybe 15, 20% sounds about right.
Okay.
That said, cultural things stay with you, right? And are very important. So to me, there's nothing more romantic to me than a block of Parmesan cheese where I know where it was made. I know how it was aged. It's very, very romantic to me. And that would be something that, of course, if I decided that right now I was going to make a decision to give it up, I could. But I think it's also incredibly important for activists that are doing this work full time to find points of pleasure and to decide not to feel, guilty about it, and to decide how you're going to do it in a way that you can really feel good about.
Yeah, I like this point you're making. And one of the things that maybe you can speak to your experience with this. It seems that there's a branch or a wing of, vegan consciousness which promotes itself through a very vitriolic kind of language and a kind of condemnatory approach to anything outside of itself. And, my contention is that doesn't really serve the overall movement, because it just kind of creates this polar opposite dynamic, and it's very, very negative. So I like what you're saying. It sounds more balanced to me. And there could be a variety of reasons why people might not be able to be vegan. And I think maybe lying in here too is, if we take someone who eats meat at every meal, if they shift to having meat, say, 1 meal a day, that's an improvement, right? I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of gray area.
Absolutely. I mean, where we are right now, at least in the US, is that there's so much low-hanging fruit, right? There's so much room for improvement in the standard American diet, and what folks, even who are really aware, my friends, young urbanites, my folks who are very involved in food, there's so much opportunity for improvement that, I don't know, to me, it's got to be a delicious revolution, right? Okay. It's got to be coming from a place of abundance and interest and beauty. And the way that sometimes I feel, the food movement and especially, a lot of vegan activists, a lot of them are great, but a lot of vegan activists I know are very hard-lined about it. Psychologically, to me, that may not be the best movement building approach. Individually, fantastic. I love when people are strong-willed about their choices. I wish everybody was strong-willed about their choices. But I do think it can be a turnoff, and I think people's food choices are so emotional and so important to themselves. Coming across as being, whether or not it's holier than thou or just more responsible, whatever frame you're coming from, I think it's probably not the best approach to make folks think that what they're eating is bad.
Yeah.
I get a lot farther in conversations with people when I ask them questions about it.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's great.
And I talk about how good the lentils smell, and olive oil, and squeeze a lemon, and you really can entice people with food. That's why it's such a beautiful movement building tool. It is delicious and it is beautiful, and there's so much opportunity for that kinds of dialogue that I wish that we used it more.
Now, in terms of health, can you characterize for us any personal experience you had when you got rid of meat? Did you notice any physical improvements?
Absolutely. For me, that was probably the most stark thing, especially since I wasn't coming at it ethically. I felt lighter. Not talking about my weight necessarily. For me personally, my systems felt like they ran better. I felt lighter was the word that I usually use to characterize it. And I also just felt like I was making choices every day that reinforced what I believed. And that felt incredibly good psychologically. So insofar as those are connected, which I think they are,
yeah,
it was very cool. It was very great. I've continued to sort of do little experiments with my diet to sort of test the physiological impacts. Sometimes eating more grains, sometimes eating less grains, and all of these things.
Yep.
It's an ongoing experiment, right? But
Yep.
I know for me, I feel significantly better and healthier. I get sick less. I don't have as much chronic stuff. I used to have very chronic sinus infections, for example. Mm-hmm. So I think for me, it's really the right formula.
Okay. And what's your take on the fat issue? You're probably familiar with Dr. Esselstyn and low-fat vegan approaches. Do you feel like you have the right amount of fat in your diet? Do you feel that by including dairy and eggs that the fat might be a little bit high? What's your take on that?
I eat a relatively high-fat diet for a vegetarian, and kind of on purpose. It's a very personal decision that I'm making around it, because mostly of my skin quality. What I've noticed as I've sort of experimented with eating less eggs and less cheese and less avocado, for that matter, is a decline in my skin health.
Huh.
I don't want to make really grand claims about cognition and brain quickness and all of that stuff too. I might be imagining that. But for me, fat is what makes a lot of food taste really beautiful and really appealing. And what's interesting is, a lot of my friends and family come over who are not vegetarian, and it's a beautiful way to be able to share the lifestyle with them.
Yeah.
I try and make food that's really, really tasty, not just because it's tasty and I love it, but also because I want people to feel like they're not sacrificing anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is to say, I pour on a healthy amount of olive oil into my food, for sure.
Okay. All right.
All
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And along the way, have you felt the need to supplement with anything? Like some of the ones I come across most frequently are either vitamin D and vitamin B12. What's your take on those two?
Yeah. I have tried vitamin B12. I'll be honest, I didn't see much of a difference with it myself. Because I drink milk, I am getting a bit of B12 of the B complex vitamins, so I don't worry as much about that. Mm-hmm. I have tried to do it mostly through food nutritional food, right? So I'm trying to eat a lot more seaweed to get more of the macro vitamins and complexes and all of that. I've pretty much cut out all supplements at this point. After, again, much trial and error. But I think people should absolutely do what feels right for their body. Every single one of us is different. So I always encourage my friends, if they're, toying with the idea of vegetarianism, to try it, see how it feels to you. Um, I'm lucky enough right now where I feel like I'm feeling pretty okay without it.
Okay. Okay.
The
All
biggest
right.
difference for me actually has been integrating regular exercise in. I've felt a world of difference again once I've started doing that. Of course, and that's separate. But you worry a little bit about your muscle mass and your protein to fat intake and all of that. And um, doing a light workout most days has actually probably improved the way that I feel almost as much as becoming vegetarian did all those years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point. Um, all right. So I think it's very interesting that you got into communication and then media, and because maybe you can say a little bit about this, like the effect of media on the public consciousness,
Oof.
and perhaps how that is intertwined by commercial interests. So I'm sure you've seen some of this along the way. One of the things I'm thinking of specifically is like the National Dairy Association or the Cattlemen's Association. These groups manage to actually affect scientific studies,
Oh,
and
sure.
then that information then affects public decision making. So what have you come across in that regard?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so much. It's a long and storied past. The way that the initial USDA food guidelines were created was essentially very, very closely linked to marketing with the Dairy Association and the Cattlemen's Association, as you pointed out. And of course, now nutritionists look back on the early, food pyramid guidelines, um, and everyone shakes their head. Even more broadly than that, I mean, what I came to care about a lot when I was looking at the intersection of media, privatization, and independent media was the extent to which you just hegemony is everywhere. You hear these ideas that come here, come to Stop and Shop for a sale on tomatoes. Get your tomatoes for 59 cents a pound. Everything has this dual focus on cost and convenience in our lives, and that is, I think, exploited no better than by the food and agriculture lobbies. So we take it for a given. I think most folks take it for a given that they're being done a favor when they can go to a place that'll offer them food for almost nothing. But what I started to become really interested in is who's paying for it. If nothing is free, who is paying for it? And of course, the answer was, we're paying for it in our physiological health. The folks who are employed by these businesses are certainly paying for it with their bodies and their minds and their lives. Justice became very important to me. Food justice and food worker rights were an issue that never get talked about in the media. These are invisibilized people. So to answer your question more directly, I was doing work comparing coverage on the mainstream news about food issues and by Democracy Now!
All right.
Just because
Love Amy. It's incredible.
she's such a beacon. She's changed so much for us, and I always use Democracy Now! As an example of what open, free, democratic media can do. I mean, she starts real conversations on that show that really become that gain a lot of traction and become dinner table issues. No pun intended.
Right.
So,
right.
So that was fascinating to me, and to see the extent of control, thought control that the media really can efface is large, and it was very eye-opening to start to think differently and to question that kind of the rhetoric that you hear, very, very benign things on commercials about convenience and sales and cheapness of food.
This is interesting because, if you go to a farmer's market, you can get a beautiful tomato, but you do have to pay for it.
Sure
so
do.
I like what you're saying here. Be willing to pay for these things because it's in your own interest to do so. You're not just getting a better product. There's a lot of other things that are benefiting you.
Sure. And I think that's easy to say writ large. And the problem that you run into when, you start saying we should be spending twice as much money on food. I know this is a common thing that Michael Pollan, for example, talks about is, back in the early 1900s, we used to spend almost twice as much of our household income on food as we do now. Great. There are still a lot of people in this country and in the world who can't afford a $4 tomato.
Right, right.
And that's not their fault, right? It's not the fault, of a lot of folks that they can't access the food available to them. It's not available to them, available to some people, but not available to all people, which is so much why I got involved with policy. And that is really what lights me up. Here in New York, we've had a great deal of stride made by folks at an organization called Wholesome Wave, who, for example, a couple of years ago, instituted a program called Double Bucks, where folks on food stamps could go to farmers markets and use their WIC benefits and food stamp benefits to literally double the value of their allotment, of their benefit at farmers markets, right? So their, $1, or $2 value suddenly bought them that $4 tomato or, 4 heads of lettuce. That kind of stuff to me is really interesting. It's still a Band-Aid, but it's really interesting to me. I'd love to see us fix the system and make it such that we actually prioritize fresh foods that are good for all of us. But in the meanwhile, some really interesting things are being done to level out that playing field so that folks feel like they can access food that's actually going to be nourishing to them.
That's great. That's great. A very broad question for you. How would you compare changing one's diet or improving one's diet in terms of the environmental impact compared with changing one's transportation? For example, let's say somebody switches from a gasoline car to an electric car, which may be the future for all of us anyway. But it's often said that the environmental impact of meat eating in the United States causes more pollution than the entire transportation sector. So what's your take on that?
I think those numbers are probably true. I've seen the study go in both directions, but it doesn't really matter where that fine line falls because the truth is that both are, causing emissions and hurting the environment. I think so my short answer is I think it's really great to be able to commit to lifestyle choices that are aligned with your values. If that can manifest in the form of becoming a vegetarian or cutting meat out of your diet, that's wonderful. What's true is I know a lot of people that don't have the time, busy parents, new parents or something who I say, they ask me how long it takes me to cook my meals at night. And I say, well, I'm usually sitting down after spending about an hour, maybe an hour and 15 minutes cooking my dinner. And they laugh, that it's not a lifestyle choice that's easy to make for everybody. And I understand that. If it's easier for some folks to switch, their transportation methods, to hop on their bike, to buy a hybrid, to not buy anything new at all for a year. I mean, I know people who have done all kinds of crazy things. That's great. The truth is, this is not a problem, and this is not a system that's going to get fixed by individuals making different decisions about their lives. This is not a problem that's going to get fixed by changing the light bulbs or buying a bag of beans. It's unfortunately a problem that must be fixed jointly. It's a global problem. It's a systemic problem. It's a political problem. So what I always tell people is, listen, if you want to change the world, change your house, change your eating habits, change your car, but get involved. Look at politics. Go to a march, even if it's your first one. Plug into a movement, because we're only going to make the level of change and the scale of change that we need to make if we do it together and we're working together towards changing a paradigm. You can change the paradigm in your living room, and that's great, and you should. But let that be a stepping stone towards plugging into something bigger.
Beautiful, beautiful. All right. I saw on your site there's several organizations you're involved with, so I'm going to throw them at you, and you can tell the viewer a little bit about each one and explain what it does and how they can get involved if they want to.
Is this through 350.org, say?
Yes. Yeah. And I think you on your LinkedIn site, you've got some stuff there too.
Great.
So let's see, the Institute for the, let's see, what was that? Let me skip to the New Food Economy. Tell us what that is, the New Food Economy.
Great. The New Food Economy is actually largely a business-to-business business that is going to be based up in Maine.
Okay.
They are working to make connections between local farmers, restaurateurs, and food businesses throughout the Northeast and then increasingly throughout the country to be able to find each other and network better so that folks who, are sustainable caterers that also want to have, post-recycled consumer products available for their jobs can actually find great ways to access that and to build relationships with vendors that are like-minded.
Okay. And so that's the full thing is the Institute for the New Food Economy.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
And so, they're also putting out writing and media pieces and commentary specifically for a business-to-business environment, which is actually filling a niche that is long overdue. It's incredibly hard to start a new business in New York, where I live at least, and know what the playing field is and know what the landscape is for other sustainable vendors. You can, of course, look up and buy a list for, all of the different commercial vendors that are available to you, from restaurant supply to, HVAC to your consumer products, but none of them are specifically angled around who are folks that are also supporting your mission, who are folks who have products that you're going to want to purchase.
Great.
So they're making those sorts of resources available to businesses specifically.
Okay, interesting. And is there a site that people can go to for that? Is that?
It should be newfoodeconomy.org.
Okay. Okay, great.
They actually just relaunched their new site, so I feel like I want to double confirm that for you. But
all right.
It's up and running. Newfoodeconomy.com, excuse me.
.com. Okay, great. And then the other one I saw was Food Systems Network. I guess that sounds related. Is that similar, different?
In fact, it's different. And it was a really important group in the New York City food policy landscape for a long time. We only recently, under the last mayoral administration, got a food policy office within the mayor's office of New York City to, think about issues like procurement and all of that. The New York City Food Policy Council got together groups of volunteers who worked throughout the food and environmental sector to, examine the landscape in the metro area and to make recommendations to policymakers around this stuff. So Mayor Bloomberg, our last mayor here, did institute a food policy office, and now under de Blasio there is one as well. So the group has actually decided to dissolve. Everyone is still very active and working. One is a restaurateur, one is the chair of Slow Food New York City. Everybody's still working, but that group has since become inactive heavily because there's a lot of folks who are being paid full time to work on this stuff now.
Okay, great. Okay. And then in that last sentence you mentioned slow food. So define that for us and where is that all at?
Sure. So Slow Food's motto is food that is good, clean, and fair. It's an international organization that started out of northern Italy back in the early 80s, I believe. It really started as an idea and as a movement, and it spread because it's a beautiful idea. It spread throughout Europe and, of course, now is all over the world. I worked for several years for the Slow Food United States office that helps to resource local activists and folks in every state in the country to, work on policy things, to support local food infrastructure and farmers, to build awareness for good, clean, and fair food writ large. In most states, there are several large groups that are active and sort of do their own sorts of programming and outreach. New York City has a very large and active base. And so the guy I was thinking of in particular, who I used to work with at Food Systems Network, is one of the chairs, long-standing chairs of the New York region for all of the different chapters of slow food throughout the New York metro area, working to bring good, clean, and fair food ideas to everyone.
Beautiful. And in any of these areas that we've been touching on, to what degree, if any, do animal ethical rights folks have an influence? Does that get mixed in? Sounds like slow food is more kind of an umbrella for any kind of food, whether it be meat, vegetable, fruit, whatever. To what degree does ethics play a role in any of this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, within slow food specifically, there are folks who are very diehard about, sustainable and ethical ranching. There are innumerable vegans. It sort of runs the gamut. And it's all sort of covered under the idea of clean, right? So if their three pillars are good, clean, and fair, I said clean, I meant fair. Under the pillar of fair, under good, clean, and fair, folks at Slow Food, whether or not they are avid omnivores or they are, militant vegans, are very concerned with animal rights. Whether or not they are raising the animals themselves, they want those animals raised in a way that they are healthy, they are happy animals. They are being, even at slaughter, are being slaughtered in a way that is not, overly traumatizing. It's just not, separating them from their mothers at birth, to increase milk production. All of the minutia that you would think about as someone who is an animal rights activist. Absolutely, Slow Food is all about that. And in fact, many slow food activists are vegans or are vegetarians. I mean, I certainly was when I was there. And there's a lot of us there too, who are talking about consciousness. That's something that I get very, very worked up about myself is, if you have the privilege and the ability and the time and the skills to feed yourself well, ending another consciousness to me is something that is unnecessary and unconscionable. So yes, so slow food is a place where that conversation definitely happens quite a lot. And then, it filters out when you think about the New York City food policy landscape, and procurement. That's a really very interesting place where it also comes up a lot is, to what extent are we feeding our public school meals, meat and culturally appropriate foods? To what extent should we have, salads at every meal available for kids? These very basic things, are big conversations right now at the municipal level and at the state level and in procurement specifically.
That's really encouraging because what you're alluding to there is that in a way those things were not even part of the conversation before. So,
oh no,
which is great.
Sure. I mean, for all of the room that's left between where we are now and where we need to be, there's been a lot of progress, even since, and I'm still fairly young. Even when I started working in this 10 years ago, the Child Nutrition Reauthorization Act in New York City, for example, has made strides. It's become a much more visible issue for people. And that act, that piece of policy in New York, is extraordinarily important. It dictates so much about the way that our New York City school system procures food and then delivers it to our children. The DOE in New York buys hundreds of thousands of pounds of food and processes it every day. So when you're thinking about sourcing and creating demand and influencing markets, it's huge.
Yeah, that's good news. Tell us a little bit about 350.org. So that's where you're at now, and how did you get involved there, and what are you doing there? And maybe tell us a little bit about Bill McKibben too.
Great. I got involved with 350.org after being in the food movement for a long time. I started asking myself the question more and more, well, why? Well, why? Well, why? Well, why? And what I kept landing at is the way that our government treats fossil fuels, the way that we subsidize their use, the way that we continue to encourage the paradigm of big fossil fuel energy, has almost everything to do with our food landscape. And I thought, if we can't fix that problem, it's going to be, if not impossible, then almost extremely, extremely hard to try and fix the food system. So I started to get more and more interested in climate. I am, outside of being an organizer and a campaigner, I'm trained as an executive assistant. And when I found that Bill McKibben was looking for someone to help him out at 350, I jumped at the chance. So I've been with 350 now for a couple of years, and 350 works worldwide to fight the climate crisis. Is about as broad as it can get. We create campaigns to build public awareness and to try and create political will for better energy solutions around the world. So changing from a paradigm of old fossil fuel infrastructure and old fossil fuel projects and the systems that support them to a new paradigm where energy can be dispersed, can be just, can be renewable, can be clean, and can create a completely new economic environment in the US and certainly beyond. It started here in the US, up in the state of Vermont, actually in the Northeast, but has spread all over the world to every country that's known besides North Korea. So we're doing work all over the place.
That's great. So do you guys try and influence politicians directly?
Sometimes, yeah. Okay. We like to think about it in terms of offense and defense, right? We do a lot of defensive work. A energy company wants to build a new pipeline through the middle of the United States of America, and we have to respond to it. We have to say that infrastructure project's going to lock us into 40 more years of fossil fuel development. We're going to try and block this project. But we also go on the offense. Since 2012, there's been a huge push through 350.org and a handful of other large organizations that we work closely with on something called divestment, which is getting institutions, everything from colleges and universities to state pension plans, to divest their holdings in fossil fuel companies, which largely is a very smart economic decision, but also we're encouraging folks to think about it from a moral place as well. So of course, all of those kinds of campaigns and ideas have huge policy implications. So certainly,
I just saw an unfortunate article about Nevada, and apparently they're trying to pass a law. Generally, some states, not all, but some states have passed laws that give some incentive for people to go solar, and that was the case in Nevada for a while. And apparently they're trying to put through this law that is retroactive in terms of getting money back from residents who had previously gotten benefits for going solar. Are you familiar with this? And I think it's going to be fought in the courts, and hopefully it'll be overturned. But what's your take on that? I mean, the kind of thing I'm hoping for is when we can finally get politicians to become accountable for these things. But it seems like a lot of this stuff goes under the radar, and they get away with this kind of thing.
Yeah, it's very technical, right? So yeah, it's hard to make these issues simple enough for most people to see how outrageous they are. We're working on it. A lot of folks are working on it.
Yeah.
The issue there, and this is not isolated to, you said Nebraska, you were hearing about this?
I think it's Nevada.
Nevada.
Which is really weird, Vanessa, because, they've just done this big deal with Elon Musk, and they got this huge Tesla,
Right. But it's in response to that too, right? So, I mean, you have to think about this as being a business response from the old paradigm.
Right.
They are increasingly very fearful of losing the power that they have held for decades, which has been very consolidated. The energy companies and the utilities are, putting out internal reports even that are shocking to us about the extent to which they foresee the end of their business model. It's
That's
encouraging.
Great.
It's
great.
Encouraging. Yeah. But I mean, what it represents in this case, and this is true in Arizona, and there are states throughout the country who have gotten away with letting the power companies disincentivize people from installing individualized solar, which is crazy. But what they're increasingly feeling is the irrelevance of the old system of a consolidated power company providing a resource that increasingly just doesn't need to be provided, especially in states like Nevada and Arizona.
Yeah.
And California, which has decent climate policy on everything besides fracking. it is undeniable that folks should be able to use the resources available to them on their roofs as property owners, especially.
Do you remember there's a line from a Beatles tune, and it was something like, "Don't you know that the guy manufacturing cigarettes is laughing at you while you're smoking?" And this is what this reminds me of. It's like these guys are making money off of people destroying the environment, and the absence of ethics, the gall of it. It's so gigantic.
Well, Paul, I mean, one of the big pushes that I think you're going to see from the climate movement and the environmental movement in 2016 is going to be a push to expose ExxonMobil in a case. We're trying to push for a Department of Justice investigation into ExxonMobil's very deliberate misinformation campaign and cover-up of the fact that they were the first people around who are studying climate change and were studying the effects of combusting fossil fuels. You know, as it turns out, as early as the late 70s, ExxonMobil folks were, testifying and giving presentations to their board of directors saying, if we keep on this track, our business model these are the effects that our business model are going to have on the planet. The projections that they had made about the amount of carbon in the atmosphere are almost spot on to what we're seeing today.
This is especially interesting, Vanessa, considering what is there left? There's like 1 or 2% of the scientific community debates the reality of climate change. And am I not mistaken? Am I mistaken in thinking that those scientists, those very few among the much broader scientific community, come from fossil fuel interested parties, basically?
Well, you're very right that scientists claiming any sort of debate within the literature around anthropogenic climate change are very few and far between. There was also an expose. There's been an incredible amount of journalism in the past year around climate misinformation campaigns. This was all instigated by a fascinating professor at Harvard named Naomi Oreskes, who wrote this book called The Merchants of Doubt about how is it that it's taken us 25 years to even approach the conversation. So just recently, there's been this excellent journalism coming out of the LA Times and Inside Climate News. And, I think it was just 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a plant that came in and said that they were working for a fossil fuel company wanting to, pay researchers at an Ivy League institution to do some research for them. And of course, questions were asked about the extent to which the funding would need to be disclosed publicly. It came out that, in the past, it had to have been that easy to approach folks from the industry, insisting that it would be completely fine to run research, to publish it or to try and publish it, and to not disclose the source of funding. I've seen this time and time again in big ag as well.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other can of worms. But it is, there are more and more cases where, scientists and researchers out of especially Ivy League institutions, there's a proven pay line between the industry and the research that they're putting out. That research has had a completely outsized effect on the conversation.
Yeah.
And I think we're finally getting to a place where you're seen as being ridiculous if you're questioning the science.
Well, that's good.
That's certainly the narrative that we're trying. We don't respond. I mean, we at 350.org, I mean, if folks want to have a conversation with us about whether or not climate change is happening, we're not in that place anymore.
You're not wasting time. Yeah, I like that. I think I got to let you go. It's almost 1. But let me ask you lastly, if people do want the kind of information that you're talking about, I imagine they can access some of it on 350.org. Are there other resources you'd recommend for people who perhaps feel they're not getting the full story on things?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we mentioned, a good first stop is 350.org. There's a tremendous amount of research and writing and other links to lead you in other places if you visit. I would highly recommend going and visit breakfree.org,
Okay.
which will be a new campaign that a coalition of climate partners are working on for work in 2016. There's going to be a huge push in the spring. So that'll be a really interesting place to keep an eye on. For food issues in particular, I think Slow Food USA and slowfood.com, which is the international website, has fantastic writing and resources to get you really excited about what food can mean in your life. Okay. Yeah, those would be the first places I would start. And also Democracy Now! We've got to come back around to Amy and her work there.
Absolutely, absolutely.
It's a fantastic place to learn about these and other issues that are all, of course, intersected, and she does a fantastic job of spreading real news and information.
Let me ask you, has your journey at all affected your father in terms of the menu he offers? Has he added a few extra vegetarian or vegan options on the Italian menu?
I will say I was so heartened and surprised at Thanksgiving, and he, of course, cooks everything. He doesn't let anybody into the kitchen. 90% of what came out on that table was vegetarian, which was very, very sweet and very heartening. But I think it comes down to just helping people see that, this vegetarian thing isn't so bad. There's a lot of delicious stuff that you can get out of really paying attention to loving and respecting your veggies. So yeah, to some extent, I think he's coming around. It's been a slow process, but.
Vanessa, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for all the work you're doing.
Paul, thank you so much. It's been so great chatting, and thanks for having me on.
All right. Take care.
Take care. Bye.